In the name of God,
In the name of God Almighty, praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds. Blessings and peace be upon our Prophet Muhammad and his kith and kin and companions.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to offer my most sincere felicitations on your deserved election to the presidency of the General Assembly and seize the moment to express appreciation for the valuable efforts of our distinguished Secretary General. Mr. Chairman, our world today is replete with fear and hope. Fear of war and hostile regional and global relations. Fear of deadly confrontation of religious, ethnic and national identities, fear of institutionalization of violence and extremism, fear of poverty and destructive discrimination, fear of decay and destruction of life-sustaining resources, fear of disregard for human dignity and rights, and fear of neglect of morality. Alongside these fears, however, there are new hopes. The hope of universal acceptance by the people and the elite all across the globe of yes to peace and no to war, and the hope of preference of dialogue over conflict and moderation over extremism. The recent election in Iran represent a clear, living example of the wise choice of hope, rationality, and moderation by the great people of Iran. The realization of democracy consistent with religion and the peaceful transfer of executive power manifested that Iran is the anchor of stability in an otherwise ocean of regional instabilities. The firm belief of our people and government in enduring peace, stability, tranquility, peaceful resolution of disputes, and reliance on the ballot box as the basis of power, public acceptance and legitimacy has indeed played a key role in creating such a safe environment. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the current critical period of transition in international relations is replete with dangers, albeit with unique opportunities. Any miscalculation of one's position, and of course of others, will bear historic damages. A mistake by one actor will have negative impact on all others. Vulnerability is now a global and phenomenon. At this sensitive juncture in the history of global relations, the age of zero-sum game is over. Even though a few actors still tend to rely on archaic and deeply ineffective ways and means to preserve their own superiority and domination, militarism and the resource to violence and military means to subjugate others are failed examples of the perpetuation of old ways in new circumstances. Coercive economic and military policies and practices geared to the maintenance and preservation of old superiorities and domination have pursued in a conceptual mindset that negates peace, security, human dignity, and exalted human ideals. ignoring differences between societies and globalizing Western values as universal ones represent another manifestation of this conceptual mindset. Yet another reflection of the same cognitive model is the persistence of Cold War mentality and bipolar division of the world into the superior us and inferior others, fanning fear and phobia around the emergence of new actors on the world scene is another. In such an environment, governmental and non-governmental, religious, ethnic, and even racial violence has increased. And there is no guarantee that the era of quiet among big powers will remain immune from such violent discourses, practices, and actions. The catastrophic impact of violent and extremist narratives should not, in fact, must not be underestimated. In this context, the strategic violence which is manifested in the efforts to deprive regional players from their natural domain of action, containment policies, regime change from outside, and the efforts toward redrawing of political borders and frontiers is extremely dangerous and provocative. The prevalent international political discourse depicts a civilized center surrounded by uncivilized peripheries. In this picture, the relation between the center of world power and the peripheries is hegemonic. The discourse assigning the North the center stage and the relegating the South to the periphery has led to the establishment of a monologue at the level of international relations, the creation of illusory identity distinctions, and the current prevalent violent forms of xenophobia are the inevitable outcome of such a discourse. Propagandistic and unfounded faith-phobic, Islamophobic, Shia-phobic, and Iran-phobic discourses do indeed represent serious threats against world peace and human security. This propagandistic discourse has assumed dangerous proportions through portrayal and inculcation of presumed imaginary threats. One such imaginary threat is the so-called Iranian threat, which has been employed as an excuse to justify a long catalog of crimes and catastrophic practices over the past 3 decades. The arming of the Saddam Hussein regime with chemical weapons and supporting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are just 2 examples of such catastrophes. Let me say this in all sincerity before this August World Assembly, that based on irrefutable evidence, those who harp on the so-called threat of Iran are either a threat against international peace and security themselves or promote such a threat. Iran poses absolutely no threat to the world or the region. In fact, in ideals as well as in actual practice, my country has been a harbinger of just peace and comprehensive security. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, nowhere in the world has violence been so deadly and destructive as in North Africa and West Asia. Military intervention in Afghanistan, Saddam Hussein's imposed war against Iran, occupation of Kuwait, military interventions against Iraq, brutal repression of the Palestinian people, assassination of common people and political figures in Iran, and terrorist bombings in countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon are examples of violence in this region in the last 3 decades. What has been and continues to be practiced against the innocent people of Palestine is nothing less than structural violence. Palestine is under occupation. The basic rights of the Palestinians are tragically violated, and they are deprived of the right of return and access to their homes, birthplace, and homeland. Apartheid as a concept can hardly describe the crimes and the institutionalized aggression against the innocent Palestinian people. The human tragedy in Syria represents a painful example of catastrophic spread of violence and extremism in our region. From the very outset of the crisis, and when some regional and international actors helped to militarize the situation through infusion of arms and intelligence into the country and active support of extremist groups, we emphasized that there was no military solution to the Syrian crisis. Pursuit of expansionist strategies and objectives and attempts to change the regional balance through proxies cannot be camouflaged behind humanitarian rhetoric. The common objective of the international community should be a quick end to the killing of the innocent. While condemning any use of chemical weapons, we welcome serious acceptance of the Chemical Weapons Convention and believe that the access by extremist terrorist groups to such weapons is the greatest danger to the region that must be considered in any disarmament plan. Simultaneously, I should underline the illegitimate and ineffective threat to use, or the actual use of force will only lead to further exacerbation of violence and crisis in the region. Terrorism and the killing of innocent people represent the ultimate inhumanity of extremism and violence. Terrorism is a violent sport and knows no country or national borders. But the violence and extreme actions such as the use of drones against innocent people in the name of combating terrorism should also be condemned. Here, I should also say a word about the criminal assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. For what crimes have they been assassinated? The United Nations and the Security Council should answer the question: have the perpetrators been condemned? Unjust sanctions as manifestation of structural violence are intrinsically inhumane and against peace. And contrary to the claims of those who pursue and impose them, it is not the state and the political elite that are targeted, but rather it is the common people who are victimized by these sanctions. Let us not forget millions of Iraqis who, as a result of sanctions, covered in international legal jargon, suffered and lost their lives, and many more who continue to suffer all through their lives. These sanctions are violent, pure and simple, whether called smart or otherwise, unilateral or multilateral. These sanctions violate inalienable human rights, inter alia, the right to the peace, right to development, right to access to health and education, and above all, the right to life. Sanctions beyond any and all rhetoric cause belligerence, warmongering, and human suffering. It should be borne in mind, however, that the negative impact is not merely limited to the intended victims of sanctions. It also affects the economy and livelihood of other countries and societies, including the countries imposing sanctions. Mr. President, Excellencies, violence and extremism nowadays have gone beyond the physical real and have unfortunately afflicted and tarnished the mental and spiritual dimensions of life in human societies. Violence and extremism leave no space for understanding and moderation as the necessary foundations of collective life of human beings and the modern society. Intolerance is the predicament of our time. We need to promote and reinforce tolerance in light of the religious teachings and appropriate cultural and political approaches. The human society should be elevated from the state of mere tolerance to that of collective collaboration. We should not just tolerate others. We should rise above mere tolerance and dare to work together. People all over the world are tired of war, violence, and extremism. They hope for a change in the status quo. And this is a unique opportunity for us all. The Islamic Republic of Iran believes that all challenges can be managed successfully through a smart, judicious blend of hope and moderation. Warmongers are bent on extinguishing all hope, but hope for change, for the better is an innate, religious, widespread, and universal concept. Hope is founded on the belief in the universal will of the people across the globe to combat violence and extremism, to cherish change, to oppose imposed structures, to value choice, and to act in accordance with human responsibility. Hope is, no doubt, one of the greatest gifts bestowed upon human beings by their all-loving Creator. And moderation is to think and move in a wise, judicious manner, conscious of the time and the space, and to align exalted ideals with choice of effective strategies and policies, while cognizant of objective realities. The Iranian people, in a judiciously sober choice in the recent elections, voted for the discourse of hope, foresight, and prudent moderation, both at home and abroad. In foreign policy, the combination of these elements means that the Islamic Republic of Iran, as a regional power, will act responsibly with regard to regional and international security, and is willing and prepared to cooperate in these fields bilaterally as well as multilaterally with other responsible actors. We defend peace based on democracy and the ballot box everywhere, including in Syria, Bahrain, and other countries in the region, and believe that there are no violent solutions to world crisis. The bitter and ugly realities of the human society can only be overcome through recourse to and reliance on human wisdom, interaction and moderation, securing peace and democracy, and ensuring the legitimate rights of all countries in the world, including the Middle East, cannot and will not be realized through militarism. Iran seeks to resolve problems, not to create them. There is no issue or dossier that cannot be resolved through reliance on hope and prudent moderation, mutual respect, and rejection of violence and extremism. Iran's nuclear dossier is a case in point. As clearly stated by the leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, acceptance of the inalienable right of Iran constitutes the best and the easiest way of resolving this issue. This is not political rhetoric. Rather, it is based on a profound recognition of the state of technology in Iran, global political environment, and the end of the era of zero-sum games, and the imperative of seeking common objectives and interests toward reaching common understanding and shared security. Put otherwise, Iran and other actors should pursue two common objectives as two mutually inseparable parts of a political solution for the nuclear dossier of Iran. One, Iran's nuclear program, and for the matter, that of all other countries, must pursue exclusively peaceful purposes. I declare here openly and unambiguously that, notwithstanding the positions of others, this has been and will always be the objective of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Nuclear weapon and other weapons of mass destruction have no place in Iran's security and defense doctrine and contradict our fundamental religious and ethical convictions. Our national interests make it imperative that we remove any and all reasonable concerns about Iran's peaceful nuclear program. 2. The second objective, that is, acceptance of and respect for the implementation of the right to the enrichment inside Iran and enjoyment of other related nuclear rights, provides the only path toward achieving the first objective. Nuclear knowledge in Iran has been domesticated now, and the nuclear technology, inclusive of enrichment, has already reached industrial scale. It is therefore an illusion and extremely unrealistic to presume that the peaceful nature of the nuclear program of Iran could be ensured through impeding the program via illegitimate pressures. In this context, the Islamic Republic of Iran, insisting on the implementation of its rights and the imperative of international respect and cooperation in this exercise, is prepared to engage immediately in time-bound and result-oriented talks to build mutual confidence and removal of mutual uncertainties with full transparency. Iran seeks constructive engagement with other countries based on mutual respect and common interests, and within the same framework does not seek to increase tensions with the United States. I listened carefully to the statement made by President Obama today at the General Assembly. Commensurate with the political will of the leadership in the United States, and hoping that they will refrain from following the short-sighted interests of warmongering pressure groups, we can arrive at a framework to manage our differences. To this end, equal footing, mutual respect, and the recognized principles of international law should govern the interactions. Of course, we expect to hear a consistent voice from Washington. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, a dominant voice has been repeatedly heard. The military option is on the table. Against the backdrop of this illegal and ineffective contention, let me say loud and clear that peace is within reach. So, in the name of the Islamic Republic of Iran, I propose, as a starting step, the consideration by the United Nations of the project, The World Against Violence and Extremism. Let us all join this wave. I invite all the states, international organizations, and civil institutions to undertake a new effort to guide the world in this direction. We should start thinking about coalition for enduring peace all across the globe instead of the ineffective coalitions for war in various parts of the world. Today, the Islamic Republic of Iran invites you and the entire world community to take a step forward, an invitation to join the wave, World Against Violence and Extremism. We should accept and be able to open a new horizon in which peace will prevail over war, tolerance over violence, progress over bloodletting, justice over discrimination, prosperity over poverty, and freedom over despotism. As beautifully said by Ferdowsi, the renowned Iranian epic poet, be relentless in striving for the cause of good. Bring the spring, you must. Banish the winter, you should. Notwithstanding all difficulties and challenges, I'm deeply optimistic about the future. I have no doubt that the future will be bright, with the entire world solidly rejecting violence and extremism. Prudent moderation will ensure a bright future for the world. My hope, aside from personal and national experience, emanates from the belief shared by all divine religions that a good and bright future awaits the world. As stated in the Holy Quran, and we proclaimed in the Psalms, after we had proclaimed in Torah, that my virtuous servants will inherit the earth. Thank you, Mr. President.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the statement just...
And as you can see there, live from the United Nations, the UN General Assembly, we saw that it's the 68th UN General Assembly gathering, as you can see there, and we saw that Iranian President Hassan Rouhani delivered his first ever speech as President of the Islamic Republic of Iran since taking office in June 14th. He won the June 14th presidential election, which he described as great manifestation of true democracy there. Just to sum up what Mr. Rouhani said at the UN General Assembly in his first ever address to that assembly, he was quick to point to some of the critical issues that have become a cause for concern for many countries around the world. He spoke of the threat and fear of sectarian and religious tensions in the world and the neglect of morality and humanity. Yet he said despite all these vices, there is hope for a better future and for peace to replace war. He pointed to the recent wave of Islamophobia and Iranophobia, refuting and rejecting such a propagandistic movement. He condemned the arming of Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons, the use of US assassination drones in Muslim countries, the occupation of Palestinian land and the killing of Palestinian people at the hands of the Israelis, not to mention other innocent people around the world. He brought up the crisis in Syria and slammed what the Al-Qaeda terrorists and Takfiris are doing in that country. President Rouhani clarified Iran's position on chemical weapons and said Tehran has always condemned the possession and use of chemical weapons and other WMDs. He said sanctions violate basic human rights, referring to the sanctions imposed on the Islamic Republic. He said tolerance should be exercised for better relations to be built, and that the use of force will not solve any problem or crisis around the world, whether it's Syria, Bahrain or Iran's nuclear issue. He then went on to again stress that Iran's nuclear program does not deal with nuclear weapons, rather its enrichment process is solely for peaceful purposes. He pointed to the speech of Obama, saying that he hoped the West would refrain from militarism and the mutual respect and the true recognition of international law, and that Tehran is waiting for a consistent response from Washington, not words of threat. He finally wrapped up by calling on world countries to join the ever-growing wave of peace and awakening. Words there by Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, his first ever address at the UN General Assembly. It's the 68th UN General Assembly gathering, as you saw there live from New York. Let's put this Iranian President's UN General Assembly address into context. Let's talk to Iranian journalist and political commentator, Mr. Hamid Golpira. Welcome to the program, sir. Mr. Golpira, first of all, what was your impression of Mr. Rouhani's first ever speech at the General Assembly?
Well, I thought he did a good job. I thought it was a good introduction for him. He presented the country in a nice manner, in a good manner, and I think he had a good rhythm in the delivery. This wasn't too long, it wasn't too short a speech, and he made some good points, especially about this tolerance and going beyond tolerance and things like this wave against against violence and extremism. I thought these were some good points he made.
Yeah, but what was the tone of his speech, do you think? How was it presented?
Well, I thought he didn't seem, it didn't seem like he was trying to be combative and challenging, but like trying to be inclusive, which I think that's good, like to show that he and the country are ready to interact with the world, where some others might have a style that seems to be more confrontational. I thought his style was more, was more inclusive, was more suggestive of interaction with the world. So I thought that was good.
Considering that Mr. Rouhani's speech came after President Obama's speech, some say that Obama's speech was mostly had a positive tone towards Iran this time around. How positive do you think that speech was when it comes to actions?
Well, we don't know what the actions are going to be in the future, and everything depends on a various number of variables that come into play. But the initial presentation was good. He mentioned that the coup d'état and assistance of the U.S. and the U.S. CIA against the coup d'état against the Mossadegh government of Iran in 1953. That was a good point. He mentioned that Iran has the right to nuclear technology, or peaceful nuclear technology and nuclear energy, and that was a good point. He also said that the U.S. doesn't want to do regime change against Iran. All of those, again, were, there were points that seemed to, again, say that it's like reaching out a hand of friendship. At least has the impression of that. I mean, how things will pan out and play out in the future, it's hard to say. But at least it's an introduction. It's a beginning, and also it's not the rhetoric that you see from some of the right-wing Republicans in the U.S. who have a much more aggressive and confrontational style toward Iran. So I thought that it was much more, having a friendly style, having at least an open style, if not everything, perfect, but how it was at least friendly and good and constructive.
We know that Obama said problems with Iran will not be solved overnight. How long do you think these problems will take to be solved? I mean, considering that there's a new Iranian administration in place, there's hope for talks with the P5+1 about the nuclear issue.
Well, I think he was right to say they will not be solved overnight, and that's good that he's being somewhat realistic and pragmatic, because sometimes you can set too high goals and we want to resolve everything immediately, and then that doesn't happen, and some people become discouraged. So if people aren't thinking that too much progress is going to be made too fast, then they don't get false hopes and then have their hopes dashed. So that's a good point, I think, that he made. But at the same time, when would things happen? I mean, like I said, again, it depends on all these various number of variables happening. But I think in some ways, Barack Hussein Obama is in some ways a good person to interact with the world and with Iran. I mean, his grandfather was Muslim. His middle name is Hussein. So he is somebody, I think, who has at least a little bit more, or a lot more probably, understanding of how the world works, the international world, than many other presidents of the United States that didn't have as much international experience as him. He lived in Indonesia, a Muslim country. He can talk Indonesian, so he has some connection with the world, much more than some other U.S. officials and U.S. presidents. So he's already in a better situation to interact with a country like Iran. So there's some sign of hope. How fast that will go, I don't know for sure. Like I say, he's going to face problems from Republicans in Congress. There's going to be other elements that maybe don't want Iran and the U.S. to have better relations, or the nuclear issue of Iran to ever be resolved. So some of that will also be a problem. So
and of course that's the point I wanted to raise with you about the sanctions on Iran. I mean, we have positive words from Obama about having better ties with Iran, but the fact is that the people of Iran are waiting for actions, not words. I mean, they're waiting for the sanctions to be lifted. Who in the United States has the authority to do so?
Well, the Congress would have to approve these things, and that's again a problem that the House of Representatives.
Especially considering the fact that the Congress, many say, is dominated by Israeli lobbies.
Well, very much it is so, and the lower house, the House of Representatives, is majority Republicans who have not been so traditionally favorable toward Iran. So that's a problem too. But at the same rate, if something seems to be moving forward, Obama or some others may be able to push something through, because I know the sanctions are a problem. Sanctions are a problem for the Iranian economy, making serious problems for the Iranian economy right now. So even if some of the sanctions were diminished or lessened or some were removed or eliminated, it would be a good benefit for Iran, and people would see that as a goodwill gesture here in Iran.
Indeed. I'm told by our people in the gallery that I'm joined by Mr. E. Michael Jones, editor of Culture Wars online magazine, joining us via Skype from Indiana. Welcome to the programme, sir. Mr. Jones, I presume that you heard Mr. Rouhani's first ever address to the UN General Assembly. What was your impression of the speech? What was the tone of the speech, do you think?
Well, I thought it was firm at the beginning. I didn't know what to expect in that regard, whether it was going to be more conciliatory than firm. But I think he stated the case that the world is pretty much sick of these so-called hypocritical humanitarian interventions that cause all sorts of death throughout the world and are really just an excuse for imperial expansion. So he dealt with that firmly. And I think also importantly, he talked about these warmongering pressure groups. This is the crucial issue in America right now. The Israel lobby dominates our government. It dominates our foreign policy, and this is not the will of the American people. So by pointing, he didn't mention the Israel lobby, but I think it's pretty clear who these warmongering pressure groups are. By pointing that out, he opened up a front, an internal front in the United States, whereby the people who are tired of war can start addressing the issue by naming who's responsible for it. And then after that, he proposed what I think is the right solution. It's a spiritual solution. He's calling for all of the world's religions to work for peace. I think we saw the effect of that just this past week when the Pope responded to the world situation, to what looked like a beginning of another world war in Syria. It could have happened that way. And then I'd have to say miraculously over that weekend, the whole situation got diffused. I think that was a spiritual event that's worth taking note of, and I think he built on that by calling for further work in that direction.
All right, let's break down Mr. Rouhani's speech into different parts. I mean, let's talk about the better ties which Obama proposed for Iran. Many say that he spoke positive about Iran this time around. I mean, but the fact that you mentioned that the Congress of America is mainly dominated by Israeli lobbies, just how can better ties with Iran be brokered with the presence of these lobbies?
It's going to be difficult, but I think that Obama has had more distance from the Israel lobby than any president in recent memory. He has deliberately and forthrightly resisted the pressure of Benjamin Netanyahu to attack Iran. He sent Dempsey over there, and I think basically what happened is that Syria became the proxy battle that in preparation for Iran. And now that's over. And I think he's looking for a way out of this problem. I think he understands the American people don't want war. I think that over that same weekend that I talked about, when Kerry sort of offhandedly proposed this thing and Russia took up Kerry's proposal about chemical weapons, that Obama started off by talking about war in his speech, and he ended up deferring to the Russians. So I think they provided him a way out. I think Obama's looking for a way out because he knows that the Israel lobby is not in his interest. He's been fighting against it in his way for his entire administration. So this may provide him an opening to deal with that problem.
Of course, let's refer to the sanctions imposed on Iran by the West. I mean, because sanctions is the main issue on the minds of Iranians, the Iranian people. How can that issue be solved? Because, I mean, as we mentioned earlier, Obama had a positive tone. okay, better ties with Iran, but the thing is that people are waiting for more actions rather than the words.
I think the action is going to come from Europe. The European Union Court has declared the sanctions illegal. I think that once one group breaks with the sanctions, they all collapse, and it doesn't really matter whether the United States Congress, everyone's going to vote on it or not. If the European Union pulls out, then the sanctions are going to collapse because they will be the first ones to rush in and start making money here again. And America is nothing if not a commercial empire. And if they see other people are making money and they're not, they will abandon the sanctions.
All right, can you just stand by there, Mr. Jones? Mr. Golpira, Mr. Jones there pointed to the fact that Europe might start this breaking off the sanctions, a domino effect, as he mentioned there. How do you see it?
Well, it is heading in that direction. One European court did make a ruling that some of the sanctions were illegal, so it is a beginning. And I think he's correct when he said if one breaks, then suddenly, and like I say, if these U.S. corporations see that European companies and others are Japanese and are making money in Iran through investments in Iran, then they also might become.
So do you think Europe does have the boldness to start this off?
Well, maybe that's not 100% certain they'll do it, but they began some things with this recent court ruling that said that some of the sanctions were illegal on some entities. So it is a beginning to start with now. Like how they will proceed, well, the future is, to see. But it looks like they're going in that direction, and perhaps then the world will follow. There's a possibility of that, I think.
Right. Let me put this question. Many have asked this question that. What have been the costs and benefits of breaking bridges with Iran for the West?
Well, for the West, I mean, they got some benefit in they kind of demonized Iran and isolated Iran, also somewhat weakened the economy, although there was still oil trade. But the fact that it isn't as integrated into the international trade and international community as it could be, that caused some problems for the economy. And where they lose out is that on the same rate, they seem to be isolating a country. Some other Islamic countries and Islamic people might say, oh, they're isolating an Islamic country. Companies and businesses lost out that they could have been investing, and some other companies from, say, China and other countries came and they got those investment opportunities that some companies based in the U.S. could have obtained. And also the fact that there's almost no tourism and interaction. I think on a kind of a social cultural level there's a law, so that we wouldn't maybe see that as a kind of like political governmental or some kind of thing, but that also happens. There's not enough contact between people coming from North America or the USA. There's not so many tourists coming to here in Iran and almost none going to there, so this kind of cutoff of contact between peoples, it creates, there's this social cultural effect. There's no cultural or limited cultural interaction, so people don't know each other, limited social interaction, so that has a social effect too. So that's one of the losses for the Western world in general.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Mr. Jones, what do you think? How advantageous or disadvantageous has this breaking of ties with Iran been? I mean, you came to Iran about a year ago. We met up with each other. How did you see it? How do you see this wave?
Well, first of all, the advantages are all for Israel here. Israel wants to isolate Iran because Iran is the only threat to Israel's entire hegemony over the entire Middle East. And I think that what we're seeing now is a sense that maybe stability in Iran is not such a bad idea, given the chaos that everything is descending to. I think a crucial turning point came when John Kerry became Secretary of State, and he realized he basically decided that we're not going to give heavy weapons to the Takfiri in Syria because they're going to use them against Israel. At a certain point, this whole policy of spreading anarchy in the Middle East, I think it was seen as being counterproductive. Now, that's the main issue. So what we have is a movie like Argo, produced by Jewish Hollywood, to inflame American public opinion against Iran for Israel's interests. So what we need to do is break this lock that the Israel lobby and Hollywood have over the United States public mind. And I think that's the big thing that I saw when I was in Tehran, that there's a worldwide movement now that is tired of this Jewish hegemony over world culture and is looking for some type of better solution, multipolar, something that respects the ethnic and religious sensibilities of all the people throughout the world and doesn't try to impose this kind of tyranny on everyone.
Now, governments aside, what do you think the people in America, I mean the public opinion in America, what do they think about Iran? How would they like to have relations with Iran?
Well, right now they're filled with fear. I mean, I was just at a conference with my wife, and a lady leans over to my wife and says to her, well, weren't you afraid when your husband went to Iran? I mean, this is typical. This is a lady who's very sympathetic to what I'm saying. And like the article I wrote about cultural jihad in Iran, is a subscriber to Culture Wars magazine, and still she has this fear. I mean, this is the whole point. This is what I said in Tehran. I said, fear is useless. What is needed is love. And I think President Rouhani has taken this note and put this whole discussion on a much higher, much more spiritual plane than it has existed up until now. And I think that's the solution to bring it for peace.
And how can such feelings of fear be allayed and be turned into confidence?
Well, when people like me come back alive, okay, I wasn't, didn't have a bag put over my head, and I wasn't thrown in the trunk of a car. I mean, we had an intelligent discussion. We had a discussion where we could say things that are taboo throughout the rest of the world. We have more freedom of expression at a conference in Iran than any place else on the face of the earth. When the word gets out like this, it's going to cause this fear to subside. And we'll begin to realize, who are the warmongers? It's the Israel lobby that's being the warmongers. It's Hollywood. It's Jewish Hollywood that are promoting this war. And we need to isolate them by exposing what their real agenda is and how this is not congruent with the interest of the American people.
Right, if you can just stand by there, Mr. Jones. Mr. Golpira, where's Mr. Jones there? He said he came to Iran. He had more freedom of expression than it was in the United States or any other country around the world. How is the issue of freedom of expression in Iran as a journalist?
Well, to a degree it's good. Some things, a lot of things you can say that you couldn't maybe say on some mainstream media outlets in the Western world. Certain things about how the world works and people who control things. I wouldn't say everything is perfect. That wouldn't be correct. And there are some things that need improvement. But what he said about that you can say some things, like probably what he's referring to, like things about like the Zionist Jewish lobby influencing the U.S. or some Zionist and Jewish influence on like places like Hollywood, or you can say that to a certain degree, but you couldn't say it maybe as freely as you could here in some Western media or mainstream Western media outlets. Maybe the alternative media outlets, you could say it more. But I also agree with him about having to have an alternative kind of media or cultural thing, something besides Hollywood that it is acting in some ways. Some Hollywood films are like a kind of cultural imperialist, having a cultural imperialist element to them, trying to promote things, trying to change people's views of thinking, think these people are good, these are bad, these ideas are good, these are bad. So yeah, there do have to be alternative, alternative cinema, alternative, just whole, like what he's saying about having a multilateral, multilateral kind of cultural cinema, media, artistic world, and we really need that now, because if you see this as there's a kind of economic hegemony and you can have a political hegemony, there also is this kind of media, artistic, musical, cinematic hegemony when certain elements much in the Western world, mostly in the Western world, and much of it in cinema in Hollywood, but in other places too, sets a tone, say, okay, this is the discourse, this is the narrative, this is what we're all saying, and then a certain voice is not allowed in there. Like whether that be the voice of Kashmir or Palestinians or poor people around the world in Bolivia or Africa or wherever, or different ideas are somehow suppressed, but then it's presented in a way as if those ideas are not. That's the trick of it. It's presented in a way as if those ideas are not being suppressed and there's freedom of expression. But in reality, those ideas are being suppressed. They are being suppressed. For example, go on a Western network and try to explain how a handful of people have trillions of dollars in this world, and half the world is making $2 or $3 a day. Literally 50% of the world. Perhaps as many as 80% of the world is earning something like less than $10 or $15 a day. Like try to explain, tell one of the Western media outlets we'd like to do an hour or two show on that. You probably wouldn't be able to do that. So, or they might give you a minute or so, but they wouldn't give you 20 minutes. They wouldn't give you time to elaborate on these themes, or how do class structures work? How is the distribution of wealth on this planet, in this earth, much less in the United States or Canada or some Western country? And that's one of the things that they're suppressing, or many other ideas in these various media and cinematic or musical or cultural, various cultural outlets. They're suppressing certain ideas, but playing it as if they're having a full spectrum of discussion.
Right. Indeed. All right, I'll just like to have a final response from Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, how do you think this whole... President Rouhani spoke about the fact that he called on the countries of the world to come together and, of course, spiritually solve issues. What do you think he meant by this?
Well, I think he was referring to what the Pope had done just a week before, calling for prayer for peace. I mean, we believers in the world believe that, why do we pray, right? If we don't think, if God is not going to answer our prayers or not going to listen to us, then why do we pray? I mean, we do believe that God is the ruler of the universe. I mean, both Christians and Muslims believe that. So you've got what, a couple billion people who believe that, whose views are constantly being excluded from the discourse of the world leaders. I think this has to change. And I think it's going to change because we saw the effects of this spiritual power. And I think that President Rouhani was talking about that. That's what needs to be brought into the discussion. This desire for peace and the desire of the believers throughout the world to pray for peace as well.
Indeed. All right, we'll leave our discussion there. Many thanks there to Mr. E. Michael Jones, editor of Culture Wars online magazine from Indiana, joining us via Skype there for his thoughts. And of course, Hamid Golpira, journalist and political commentator from Tehran, for your thoughts on the speech there by Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Well, stay tuned to Press TV. We'll be back in about 5 minutes' time with the international headlines. Don't go away.